Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a land that seems almost designed to test the people who live on it. A land of high stone ridges and folded mountain walls, of salt deserts that shimmer white beneath a merciless sun, of wind-scoured plains, narrow green valleys, and cities that learned very early how precious shade could feel. This is Iran. And for more than 2,500 years, it has stood at one of the most dangerous crossroads on Earth. Empires have come here with iron certainty. Greeks crossed into it with the bright arrogance of conquest. Arab armies arrived carrying a new faith and a new language of power. Turks rode in from the steppe. Mongols descended with a violence so vast that whole cities seemed to vanish into dust and memory. And yet, somehow, Iran remained. Not always in the same shape, not always under the same rulers, not always speaking in the same political voice, but it remained, in its language, in its habits of memory, in the stubborn continuity of its festivals, its stories, its poetry, its gardens, its ways of sitting together over food and speaking of the world with an old and practiced depth. That is the quiet mystery at the center of tonight's journey. How does a civilization survive repeated conquest without becoming unrecognizable to itself? Part of the answer begins with the land. Iran is not an easy country. The Iranian plateau rises high above sea level, a vast stony tableland ringed and broken by mountains. To the west, the Zagros Range folds across the horizon in long limestone ridges, difficult to cross and difficult to rule. To the north, the Alborz Mountains rise sharply above the Caspian coast, catching cold air and snow. In the center and east lie immense deserts, where heat can seem less like weather than like a force pressing down on the body itself. Water, here, has never been casual. To live on this plateau meant learning patience. It meant storing winter snowmelt, drawing springs from the earth,
digging channels, tending orchards, and measuring life not by abundance, but by careful endurance. In many places, settlement clung to the land only because people learned to guide water underground through qanats, those remarkable tunnels that carried hidden streams for miles beneath the soil before lifting them into fields and courtyards. So from the beginning, life here trained people in a specific kind of intelligence. Not the intelligence of easy abundance, but of adjustment, of making continuity possible under pressure, of understanding that survival is not dramatic most of the time. It is practical, rhythmic, collective. It is built in irrigation lines, storehouses, village custom, seasonal memory. Long before the Persians built an empire that would astonish the ancient world, other people had already learned this lesson on Iranian soil. In the southwestern lowlands, near the old city of Susa, one of the region's earliest civilizations took root. There, in the world of Ilam, administrators recorded tribute, labor, and offerings. Temples rose in mud-brick masses from the plain. Craftsmen carved seals, shaped bronze, glazed brick, and tied the life of the city to trade routes stretching outward toward Mesopotamia and beyond. Even then, this land was connected and exposed at the same time. That would become one of its defining conditions. Iran was never isolated enough to remain untouched. It sat between worlds, between Mesopotamia and Central Asia, between the Mediterranean and India, between the pastoral steppe and the old settled cities of the Near East. Goods moved through it, armies moved through it, ideas moved through it. Religions, scripts, artistic forms, military techniques, systems of rule, all of them passed across this plateau at one time or another.
And yet the traffic went both ways. That matters, because Iran was never only a victim of invasion. It was also one of history's great absorbers. It took what arrived, broke it down, reworked it, and gave it back in altered form. The process was not always peaceful. Often it followed war, collapse, grief, and ruin. But again and again, what came from outside was made to live, eventually, in an Iranian way. You can almost feel the groundwork for that process in the first great movements of Iranian-speaking peoples onto the plateau. Over centuries, Indo-Iranian groups moved southward from the steppe, bringing with them horses, ritual traditions, oral poetry, and an early spiritual vision that would later flower into Zoroastrianism. Their world was full of fire, sky, oath, and moral struggle. Truth mattered, purity mattered, the ordering of the cosmos mattered. These were not merely abstract ideas. They shaped kingship, law, household custom, and the sense that human life took place inside a larger contest between order and chaos. That theme would return again and again in Iranian history, not simply the struggle between one army and another, but between preservation and dissolution, between memory and erasure, between the house carefully kept and the storm outside the walls. By the first millennium before Christ, peoples we know as the Medes and Persians had begun to establish themselves in different parts of the plateau. At first, they were not masters of the world. They were tribal powers at the edges of stronger states, noticed by Assyrian kings mainly as suppliers of horses, tribute, and occasional obedience. But edges can be deceptive. What looks marginal in one century can become central in the next. And on this difficult plateau, where geography encouraged resilience and exposed every ruler to the discipline of survival, a particular political imagination was beginning to form, one that understood diversity because it lived among it, one that understood scale because every road outward led to another people, another climate, another local loyalty, one that understood power not only as conquest, but as the difficult art of holding many worlds together. This, in time, would help produce one of the greatest imperial traditions in history. But before empire came the older foundation, the harder, quieter one, a people learning how to remain themselves on a land that never offered comfort cheaply, a civilization forming not in softness, but in strain, a memory beginning. And memory, more than armies, is what this story will keep returning to. Because when the Greeks arrive, and the Arabs, and the Turks, and the Mongols, they will conquer cities, treasuries, palaces, and dynasties. But they will find it much harder to conquer the deeper things, the language spoken at home, the seasonal feast, the old stories, the emotional architecture of belonging, the sense that this land, however battered, still remembers its own name. Tonight, we move from endurance into ambition. Because there came a moment when the peoples of the Iranian plateau stopped living at the edges of other empires and began building one of their own. The Medes were the first to gather real force in the highlands. Tribal, disciplined, and increasingly dangerous, they helped destroy the Assyrian Empire, that old machine of terror which had dominated the Near East for generations. For a brief time, Median power seemed secure. But in the south, among the Persians of Pars, a more extraordinary figure was rising. Cyrus. His name would become one of the great names of history, But what made him remarkable was not only conquest, it was the shape of his intelligence. He seems to have understood something rare, that an empire spread across many peoples could not survive by humiliation alone. Fear could open a gate, but it could not keep a world together. So when Cyrus defeated the Medes around the middle of the 6th century BCE, he did not simply erase them, he absorbed them. Their nobles remained useful, their habits of rule continued, their prestige was not entirely broken. This would become a Persian pattern at its best. Conquer, yes,
but then preserve enough of the defeated world to make rule possible. From there, the expansion was swift and astonishing. Lydia fell in the west, rich and glittering, home of King Croesus and his famous wealth. Then Babylon, that ancient city of walls, temples, and ceremonial grandeur, opened to Cyrus with surprisingly little destruction. This mattered. Babylon was not just another prize, it was one of the great symbolic centers of the ancient world. To take it and present oneself not as a destroyer, but as a legitimate ruler, was a masterstroke. Later generations would remember Cyrus for that quality above all. Not merely as a conqueror, but as a king who knew how to enter an old civilization without making himself a stranger to it. The Persian Empire that emerged under him was something new in scale. It stretched across languages, climates, religions, and local traditions so varied that no earlier state had ever governed anything quite like it. And yet it held. Why? Because the Persians understood administration as well as war. Under Darius, who came after a violent succession struggle and then imposed order with relentless clarity, the empire became more than a collection of victories. It became a system. Provinces were organized into satrapies, taxes were regularized, roads linked distant regions. Royal couriers rode astonishing distances with speed that seemed almost magical to Greek observers. Inspectors moved through the empire as the king's eyes and ears. Coinage, measurement, and procedure helped create coherence across immense space. This was empire not as chaos, but as management. And management, though less glamorous than battle, is often what makes power real. At Persepolis, this imperial vision was carved into stone. Delegations from across the empire appear in its reliefs, bringing tribute. Textiles, horses, metalwork, animals, precious goods. Yet they are not shown as crushed slaves. They are depicted in their own dress, carrying the visual marks of their own lands. The message was subtle but powerful. Many peoples, one king. Difference preserved, hierarchy accepted. It was an elegant dream. But dreams of order are always tested. On the empire's western edge, the Greeks resisted Persian control, and those conflicts would echo for centuries in Western memory. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis. These names survived because the Greeks later told the story as one of freedom against despotism. But from the Persian point of view, the Greek world was one troublesome frontier among many, noisy, fractious, and hard to stabilize. What matters more for our story is that even when the Persians failed to subdue mainland Greece fully, the empire itself remained vast, wealthy, and internally sophisticated. It was not broken by those wars. It endured because its foundations ran deeper than any single campaign. And yet, over time, all empires begin to feel the weight of their own size. Court intrigue thickened. Succession became dangerous. Satraps accumulated regional power. Palace factions sharpened themselves in silence. The empire still looked magnificent from the outside, but inside, some of its joints were beginning to loosen. This, too, is an old pattern. A civilization can appear strongest at the very moment it becomes most vulnerable. Still, what the Achaemenid Persians created mattered far beyond their own dynasty. They established a model of rule that outlived them. Imperial roads, layered administration, flexible governance, ceremonial kingship, and the idea that many peoples could exist inside one political structure without being made identical. That legacy would survive conquest. And that is the point to remember as we move forward. Because the Greeks are coming now. Led by a young king from Macedon who will smash the Persian Empire in battle, burn one of its ceremonial capitals, and imagine himself master of Asia. He will win with dazzling speed. He will seem to end a world. But he will not end Iran. He will enter it. And,
like so many after him, he will discover that conquering the land is easier than preventing the land from changing the conqueror. Alexander came into Iran like a storm that believed in its own permanence. He was young, fast, brilliant, and already half inside a legend before he had finished making one. By the time he crossed into the Persian world, he carried the momentum of a man who had never yet been properly told no. Cities had opened, armies had broken, and each victory seemed to convince him that history itself was leaning in his direction. For Persia, though, the danger was not only military, it was symbolic. The Achaemenid Empire had ruled for generations with an almost architectural confidence. Its kings had built in stone, governed through habit, and wrapped power in ceremony so old and so carefully staged that it felt almost natural. Then, in a shockingly short span of time, that world began to split apart. At Issus, Darius III fled. At Gaugamela, the imperial field army shattered. Babylon opened its gates. Susa surrendered its wealth. And eventually Alexander reached Persepolis, that great ceremonial city in the Persian heartland, with its terraces, columns, stairways, and carved processions of tribute-bearers climbing eternally toward the king. There are moments in history when destruction feels almost theatrical. Persepolis burning was one of them. Whether the fire was revenge, drunken impulse, political theater, or some blend of all three, it mattered because people remembered it not simply as an act of war, but as a statement. One world was being consumed in front of another. A capital built to embody order, hierarchy, and imperial continuity went up in flame beneath a foreign conqueror. And yet even here, even at the moment that seems most absolute, the story is less simple than it first appears. Because Alexander did not behave like a man who truly wanted Persia erased. He wanted it inherited. That is what makes him so interesting in this story.
he destroyed the empire, yes, but very quickly he began reaching for its tools, its symbols, even its style. He adopted elements of Persian dress. He incorporated Iranian nobles into his administration. He moved inside the old machinery rather than sweeping all of it aside. He wanted the prestige of being not just a victorious invader, but the rightful ruler of what he had taken. This unsettled his own Macedonian followers deeply. To them, Persian court ritual could feel excessive, even humiliating. They had followed a conquering king, not a man they imagined bowing into Asian kingship. But Alexander had grasped something conquest often teaches the victor too late.
If you intend to rule a great and ancient land, you cannot remain entirely outside its grammar. You have to learn how power sounds there, what it wears, what it remembers. And Iran remembered a great deal. Beneath the fall of the Achaemenids, beneath the smoke and treasure and battlefield collapse, daily life did not simply stop. Villages still needed water, priests still kept ritual habits, families still spoke in the old tongues of the plateau, roads still connected fields to towns, towns to markets, markets to caravan routes. The deeper life of a civilization rarely vanishes in one dramatic stroke. It retreats, it adapts, it waits. Alexander, for all his brilliance, did not live long enough to discover how deep those roots ran. He died in Babylon in his early 30s, with his empire unfinished and his intention still larger than his ability to stabilize it. After that came the familiar struggle, generals dividing the world like men quarreling over a map that had not yet had time to settle into reality. Out of that chaos, Iran passed largely into Seleucid hands. The Seleucids brought Greek forms with them, and at first those forms seemed impressive enough to reshape the landscape. New cities appeared. Greek became the language of administration. Coins carried Greek inscriptions.
Civic life in some urban centers took on a Hellenistic appearance, all columns and theaters and imported prestige. If you stood in the right place, you might have thought the transformation was complete. But history is often trickiest at the surface. Beyond the new facades, the older life of the plateau remained surprisingly stubborn. In villages, people continued to speak Iranian dialects. Religious practice bent, survived, or withdrew, but did not disappear. Local elites learned to work within the new order while quietly carrying forward older habits of landholding, kinship, and memory. The Seleucid state could plant Greekness in cities. It could not so easily rewire the emotional and cultural life of the countryside. That difference matters, because empires often mistake the visible layer for the whole reality. They govern capitals, tax routes, fortified towns, official languages. But civilization lives just as much in things harder to register from above. How mothers speak to children, what is recited at a feast, which stories remain alive in winter rooms, what a community does when spring returns, what words it uses for grief, honor, home. Iran kept those things, not untouched, never untouched, but unextinguished. And that is why the Greek conquest, for all its military grandeur, did not become the final answer to what Iran was. Instead, it became one more layer laid over older ground. Hellenistic culture mattered. It changed art, politics, urban life, and elite self-presentation. But Iran absorbed it unevenly, selectively, and over time in its own way. The land was already beginning its old work on the conqueror. That work is rarely loud. It happens through repetition, through practicality, through the quiet persistence of what people cannot afford to forget. A foreign dynasty rules, and still the seasons come. The canals must be cleared. The grain must be stored. Marriage alliances are made. Local shrines survive in altered form. A language continues in the mouth, even when it disappears from official stone. Then, one day, the dynasty that seemed inevitable begins to thin. The Seleucid realm was too large, too stretched, too distracted by struggles elsewhere to hold the Iranian plateau with full attention forever. Its center of gravity leaned westward. Its rulers had too many problems in too many places.
And on the northeastern edges of their world, something new was gathering strength. Not Greek, not Macedonian, Iranian again. The Parthians would emerge from that frontier space with patience rather than spectacle. They would not arrive with the polished grandeur of Alexander. They would come more slowly, more flexibly, with cavalry, local alliances, and a different understanding of power. And in them, the plateau would begin one of its great acts of recovery. Not by restoring the old Persian Empire exactly as it had been. History almost never gives that kind of return. But by proving once again that conquest is not the same thing as disappearance. What returned Iran to itself was not a sudden miracle. It came from the margins, as it often does. Far from the old ceremonial capitals, beyond the polished Greek cities and the official language of Hellenistic rule, the northeastern frontier was hardening into a different kind of power. This was the world of open ground, long distances, brittle winters, and men who understood horses better than marble. A place where survival depended less on appearance than on movement. From there came the Parthians. At first, they did not look like the heirs to a great civilization. They were not wrapped in the monumental prestige of the old Achaemenid kings. They did not arrive trailing a perfected imperial ideology. What they had instead was timing, adaptability, and the patience to grow inside the weaknesses of others. That turned out to be enough. The Seleucid Empire, for all its elegance, had a fatal problem. It was too broad and too divided to remain fully present everywhere at once. Its rulers were pulled westward again and again by dynastic struggles, Mediterranean wars, and the constant strain of holding together lands that did not naturally cohere. Iran, from their point of view, was important, rich, and strategic, but it was not always where their attention rested most heavily. And power notices neglect. So when the Parthians pushed into the Iranian world, they did not need to conquer everything in one dazzling rush. They only needed to prove, step by step, that the Seleucids were no longer inevitable. A province here, a city there, a tribute network disrupted, a local loyalty transferred. Over time, the impossible began to look normal. That is often how states really fall, not in one final scene, but by slowly losing the right to be assumed permanent. Under rulers like Mithridates I, Parthian authority expanded with increasing confidence. Media fell. Mesopotamia followed. Greek kings who had imagined themselves heirs to Alexander found themselves captured, cornered, or reduced to symbols of a fading age. The center of gravity was shifting back east, back into Iranian hands. But the Parthians did not simply reverse the Greek period and pretend it had never happened. That is one of the most revealing things about Iran's long survival. It rarely preserved itself by rejecting everything foreign. More often, it endured by taking in what was useful and letting what was shallow fall away. So the Parthian world was mixed. Greek still appeared on coins, Hellenistic artistic habits lingered, court culture could feel cosmopolitan, layered, even contradictory. But beneath that surface, the political and social order was becoming unmistakably Iranian again. Great noble families held vast lands. Kingship took on older Eastern tones. Mounted warfare, kin alliances, aristocratic prestige, and local autonomy all returned with force. This was not the centralized machine of Darius. It was looser, harder to standardize, in some ways more fragile.
But it was also deeply suited to the realities of the plateau. The Parthians ruled less like engineers and more like negotiators with swords. Their empire was not built on perfect administrative symmetry. It was built on balancing power among great houses, frontier commanders, wealthy cities, and regional interests that could not simply be flattened without consequence. It was messy, sometimes dangerously so, but it worked for centuries. And in that long stretch of rule, something important happened. Iran stopped feeling like occupied ground and began to feel like a civilizational center again. You can sense this not just in kings and wars, but in texture, in the way architecture changed, in the rise of the Iwan, that deep vaulted hall open on one side, a form so perfectly suited to Iranian building that it would echo through centuries afterward. In trade routes crossing the plateau, bringing silk, spices, metals, stories. In cities like Ctesiphon, where imperial scale met older regional habits. In the slow thickening of a world that was neither purely old Persian nor purely Hellenistic, but something more durable, because it had learned from both. Durability, in Iran, rarely means purity. It means continuity through change. That is why the Parthians matter so much in this story. They proved that Iran did not need to restore the Achaemenids exactly as they had been in order to remain itself. It could survive by reassembling power in a new form, one that carried older instincts inside a changed political body. Then Rome appeared. Or rather, Rome had already been rising in the west, swallowing the Mediterranean piece by piece with that hard Roman appetite for order, prestige, and expansion. Eventually, the two worlds met along the frontier, and the result was one of antiquity's great rivalries. The Romans came east with their usual confidence. They had beaten kingdoms richer than themselves, older than themselves, and far more ornamented than themselves.
They trusted discipline, formation, command. They believed that enough Roman pressure, properly applied, could make almost anything give way. The Parthians taught them otherwise. At Carrhae in 53 BCE, Crassus marched his legions into a landscape and a style of war he did not understand. Roman infantry, so formidable in close battle, found itself exposed beneath a sky full of arrows. Parthian horse archers circled and withdrew, circled and struck again. Heavily armored cataphracts crashed in when the moment was right. The Romans tried to stand firm, but firmness has limits when death comes from mobility, distance, and exhaustion. The desert does not comfort men trapped inside their own tactical habits. By the end, the Roman army had been broken. Crassus was dead. Standards were lost. One of the proudest military systems in the ancient world had been humiliated by an empire many Romans had imagined as soft, exotic, or second-rate. It was none of those things. And the victory mattered for more than pride. It announced that Iran, under Parthian rule, was no one's easy eastern prize. Rome and Parthia would spend generations testing one another across the Mesopotamian frontier, neither fully able to absorb the other. Cities would be taken and retaken. Armenia would become a buffer, a bargaining chip, a wound that never quite closed. Campaigns would blaze and fade, but the frontier itself, for all the blood spent on it, remained astonishingly hard to settle. That stalemate tells us something. It tells us that Iran was not merely surviving now. It was exerting force, shaping the balance of the ancient world, refusing absorption not as a passive relic, but as a rival power with its own military intelligence, its own aristocratic backbone, its own sense of political reality. Still, the Parthian system had a weakness hidden inside its flexibility. The same noble families who made the empire strong could also make it unstable. A king had to manage them, persuade them, use them,
fear them. Too much central power invited resistance. Too little invited fragmentation. The balance was never easy and never permanent. Over time, that strain deepened, and once again, the next transformation would come from within Iran itself. Not from Greece, not from Rome, not from some distant invader descending all at once. From the old Persian heartland. From a man named Ardashir, who looked at the loose Parthian order and imagined something sharper, more centralized, more sacred, and more explicitly Iranian. Something that would not merely recover the prestige of empire, but fuse it to religion, kingship, and identity in a way the ancient world had not yet fully seen. The Parthians had brought Iran back. The Sasanians were about to tell it what it was again. If the Parthians gave Iran back its political weight, the Sasanians gave it a sharper sense of itself. They did not rise as strangers. They rose from the old Persian south, from Fars, where memory of earlier empire had never completely gone quiet. That mattered, because when Ardashir defeated the last Parthian king in the 3rd century CE, he was not presenting himself as just another successful warlord. He was offering something more ambitious, a restoration, a correction, a claim that Iran should not merely be ruled, but ruled properly, centralized, sacred, ordered. The Parthian world had been flexible, aristocratic, negotiated from one powerful family to another, useful in many ways, but loose in the joints. Ardashir wanted something tighter, a king above the nobles, a court that radiated authority, a state that did not merely collect loyalty, but defined the terms of it. And, crucially, he tied that vision to religion. Under the Sasanians, Zoroastrianism became more than an old spiritual inheritance. It became state architecture. Fire temples were endowed and maintained. Priests gained institutional weight. Orthodoxy hardened. The bond between kingship and cosmic order grew more explicit. The Shahanshah, the king of kings, was not simply the most powerful man in the realm. He stood, at least in theory, as the earthly defender of truth against disorder, light against the forces that corroded it. This gave Sasanian rule an unusual density. It was not just political, it was moral, ceremonial, almost metaphysical. Power came wrapped in theology. To rebel was not only to resist a government, it could be framed as a rupture in the order of the world itself. That made the state formidable. It also made it memorable. The Sasanians knew how to stage authority. You can still feel it in their rock reliefs. Kings on horseback, enemies brought low, imperial confidence cut into cliff faces as though the land itself had been recruited to testify. They understood spectacle the way strong states often do. A ruler does not merely need to win. He needs to make victory visible, permanent, and easy to read. One of the clearest examples came under Shapur I. Rome, by then, was still the great Western superpower, accustomed to giving humiliation more often than receiving it. But at Edessa, in 260 CE, Shapur captured the Roman emperor, Valerian, alive. A fact so astonishing that it almost sounds invented. A reigning Roman emperor taken prisoner by an Iranian king. The Sasanians made sure no one forgot it. In the reliefs, the Roman world appears literally lowered before Persian triumph. This was more than revenge or military pride. It was civilizational theater. Iran was announcing itself again, not as a surviving remnant,
not as a frontier power making trouble, but as a full imperial equal to Rome, and at times, its superior. Yet what makes the Sasanian period so rich is that its power was never only military. This was an era of building, administration, law, scholarship, and style. Cities grew. Court life thickened into elaborate ceremonial codes. Taxation and landholding became more structured. Social classes hardened into defined ranks.
Priests, warriors, scribes, cultivators, each had a place, a duty, a language of expectation around them. To modern ears, some of this sounds severe, and often it was. The system could be rigid. It could trap people inside inherited identities. It could concentrate power harshly. But it also created coherence. In a large empire stretched across climates and frontiers, coherence is no small achievement. And then there was the culture of refinement. The Sasanians were not a rough military regime ruling by intimidation alone. They were deeply invested in polish. Textiles, silverwork, architecture, court music, garden design, hunting iconography, royal imagery, these flourished under them with a confidence that would echo long after their dynasty fell. Later Islamic courts, from Baghdad to beyond, would inherit more from the Sasanians than they sometimes cared to admit. In the look of kingship, in bureaucratic habits, in luxury arts, in the grammar of sovereignty itself, Sasanian Iran would prove astonishingly influential. Even gains and habits of elite leisure mattered. Polo moved through this world not merely as sport, but as military training shaped into elegance. Chess, arriving from India and transformed in Persian hands, became part of a wider culture of strategy, order, symbolism. The court was never only decorative, it was pedagogical. It taught people how power should appear. But real civilizations are always more than their courts. Beyond the imperial image lay ordinary life. Villages under tax pressure, farmers tied to difficult land, merchants moving goods through routes that connected the Mediterranean to India and Central Asia, craftsmen working wood and metal and cloth, women sustaining households whose emotional labor rarely enters royal inscriptions, but without which no state would have lasted a year. Grain still had to be harvested, water still had to be managed, children still had to be raised into a world of duty, belief, and uncertainty.
This is important to remember, because empires often look most solid in retrospect when viewed from above. From below, even powerful states feel more fragile. And the Sasanians, for all their brilliance, carried strain inside their grandeur. Their rivalry with Rome and later Byzantium was relentless. Campaign after campaign bled men, treasure, and stability. Victories were real, but so were costs. A state can accustom itself to warfare so thoroughly that war begins to feel like its normal temperature. By then, exhaustion has already entered the bloodstream. Still, before that exhaustion became fatal, Sasanian civilization reached one of its most impressive heights under Khosrow I. He is remembered not only because he ruled effectively, though he did, but because he represents a certain Persian ideal, the king as organizer, patron, reformer, and guardian of intelligence. Taxation was revised, administration sharpened, military command was made more functional, scholarship flourished. At Gondeshapur, traditions from Greece, India, Persia, and the Syriac-speaking world met and mixed in ways that feel almost miraculous in hindsight. Medicine, philosophy, astronomy, translation, This was not a provincial culture hiding behind ancient prestige. It was one of the great intellectual centers of late antiquity. There is something moving about that. An empire fighting on hard frontiers, policing internal order, and still making room for books, debate, technical knowledge, and the patient transmission of learning. It reminds us that civilizations do not survive only by fighting off enemies. They survive by remaining worth inhabiting. And Sasanian Iran was very worth inhabiting. Not for everyone equally, no empire ever is, but enough to generate loyalty, continuity, and a texture of life that people recognized as distinctly their own. Which is why the fall, when it came, felt so immense. Not because the Sasanians were weak in any simple sense.
They were too sophisticated for that explanation. They fell because they had been worn down by success as much as failure. Too many wars, too much central pressure, too much strain between court, nobility, priesthood, and frontier. And then, at the edge of their world, a force they had underestimated began to gather. Arabia had long seemed peripheral to the great empires to its north, sparse, harsh, fractured. That was exactly why the Sasanians misread it. They did not yet understand that a new faith was binding the tribes into something more dangerous than a raid, more disciplined than a frontier nuisance, and more transformative than a passing military threat. By the time the truth arrived on the battlefield, it was too late for old assumptions to save them. The Arabs were coming now, and with them would come the most profound transformation Iran had yet faced. Not just a new ruling class, not just a new dynasty, a new religious and civilizational order. The question was no longer whether Iran could avoid conquest. It could not. The question was whether it could survive transformation this deep and still remain itself in any recognizable way. The Arab conquest changed Iran more deeply than anything that had come before. The Greeks had taken the empire, but not the soul of the land. The Parthians and Sasanians had restored Iranian rule in new forms. Even Rome, for all its pressure, had remained a rival at the frontier rather than a master at the center. But the coming of Islam was different. It did not simply replace one court with another. It changed the language of power, the structure of belief, the direction of history, and eventually the terms by which people understood themselves. That is why this chapter matters so much. Because if Iran could survive this, it could survive almost anything. The first collapse was military, and it came with shocking speed. The long wars between Byzantium and the Sasanians had drained both empires white. Men were dead. Treasuries were empty. Court factions had sharpened into poison. In the last years before the Arab armies arrived, the Sasanian throne changed hands so quickly that kingship itself began to look unstable, almost unreal. Generals maneuvered, nobles calculated, provinces thought of themselves first. Then the new Muslim armies came north. To the Iranian elite, Arabia had never seemed like the place from which world-ending force would emerge. It looked too harsh, too poor, too politically scattered. But that judgment belonged to an older world. Islam had done something extraordinary. It had taken tribal societies, accustomed to raiding and rivalry, and bound them into a single moral and military community, disciplined by belief and animated by a sense of destiny. The Sasanians met that force at Al-Qadisiyah and later at Nahavand, and what broke there was more than an army. It was confidence.
Once the imperial center gave way, the old order began dissolving with frightening speed. Ctesiphon, with its towering arch and accumulated luxury, was taken. Provincial resistance continued, sometimes bravely, sometimes desperately, but the logic of the war had changed. The empire was no longer defending itself as a coherent whole. It was breaking into fragments while pretending to remain intact. That is often how civilizations experience catastrophe from the inside. Not as one clear ending, but as a series of moments in which familiar structures stop answering when called. The last Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, fled eastward from province to province, still a king in title, but increasingly a fugitive in reality. There is something almost painfully symbolic in the way his story ends, not in a final blaze of imperial grandeur, but in loneliness, exhaustion, and murder far from the center of power. A dynasty that had once carved victory into mountains finished in dust and uncertainty. And still, Iran did not vanish. That is the essential thing. The Arab conquest was real.
It was vast. It brought a new ruling elite, a new sacred language, a new law, a new axis of belonging. But conquest is never the whole story. What happens after conquest matters just as much. And in Iran, what happened after was one of the most remarkable cultural adaptations in world history. At first, Arab-Muslim rule created a hierarchy that placed Arabness and Muslim identity near the top of public power. For many Iranians, especially those who remained Zoroastrian, the new order could feel both politically humiliating and materially costly. Non-Muslims paid the jizya tax. Arab elites occupied privileged positions. Persian converts to Islam often found that conversion did not bring full equality right away. They were Muslim, yes, but still marked as lesser in status. That tension mattered, because it meant Iran did not convert all at once in some simple wave of persuasion. Conversion was gradual, uneven, strategic, spiritual, economic, familial. In some places, it came through conviction, in others, through pressure, in others, through the slow logic of living inside a system that rewarded belonging and taxed distance. It took generations. Meanwhile, beneath the new ruling order, older continuities remained alive. People still spoke Persian in homes, in markets, in ordinary life. Spring still came. Families still gathered. Nowruz, with all its pre-Islamic depth, did not disappear. That alone tells you something important. A society can accept a new religion and still carry older rhythms forward beneath it. Ritual, memory, and identity do not always travel in the same straight line. Zoroastrianism, too, did not vanish overnight. Priests preserved texts. Communities endured, though diminished. In some regions, old beliefs withdrew rather than broke. In others, they mingled indirectly with the moral imagination of the new Islamic world. Iran was changing profoundly, but it was not becoming blank. And then, slowly, the deeper reversal began. The Umayyad Caliphate, ruling from Damascus, made the mistake many conquerors make. It assumed military victory had settled the question of legitimacy. But in the eastern provinces, especially in Khorasan, resentment thickened. Arab settlers were divided among themselves. Non-Arab Muslims were tired of being treated as second-class believers. Older local loyalties had not disappeared. They had simply learned patience.
When the Abbasid Revolution came in the 8th century, it came in large measure through Eastern energy, Eastern armies, Eastern grievances. Iran did not seize the caliphate for itself, not formally, but it helped remake the Islamic world from within. This is one of the great Iranian patterns. When direct resistance becomes impossible, influence changes method. Instead of trying to restore the Sasanian Empire exactly as it had been, Iranian elites, administrators, scholars, and converts entered the new Islamic order and slowly reshaped it. Bureaucratic habits that had older Persian roots reappeared in Abbasid governance. Court culture grew more elaborate, more ceremonially rich, more Eastern in texture. The center of gravity shifted toward Iraq and Iran, toward lands long accustomed to imperial sophistication. Persia had been conquered, yes, but now it was beginning to teach the conquerors how to rule. This is where survival becomes more interesting than simple resistance, because Iran did not endure by sealing itself off. It endured by participating so deeply in the new Islamic civilization that it became one of its chief makers. Persian administrators ran courts. Persian intellectual habits enriched theology, science, literature, and political thought. Persian models of kingship, etiquette, statecraft, and high culture moved quietly into the bloodstream of the caliphate. Even the Persian language, which might have seemed most vulnerable at first, began its extraordinary comeback. Not immediately. Arabic was the language of revelation, law, prestige, and scholarship.
That could have been the end of Persian as a serious literary medium. In many places, that is what conquest eventually does. A language gets pushed downward until it becomes local, domestic, forgettable. But Persian refused that fate. It remained alive in speech long enough to return in writing, and when it returned, it did so with astonishing force. That return will matter in the next part more than almost anything else, because Iran's deepest victory after the Arab conquest was not military. It was literary, poetic, civilizational. It was the decision, repeated across generations, not to let memory die simply because the empire had. And out of that decision would come one of the most powerful cultural recoveries in history: the rebirth of Persian language, Persian imagination, and Persian identity inside an Islamic world Iran had helped build. Empires usually leave ruins behind them. Walls collapse, dynasties disappear. Administrative systems that once felt eternal end up as broken seals, scattered coins, and names that survive mostly in footnotes. But the deeper damage of conquest is often harder to see. It happens when a people begin to lose confidence in the language that carries their memory. That is where Iran did something extraordinary. After the Arab conquest, Arabic became the language of revelation, law, theology, scholarship, prestige. If you wanted to speak at the highest level of the new civilization, Arabic stood before you like a gate that could not be walked around. And for a time, it must have seemed possible that Persian would remain alive only in the private world, spoken at home, murmured in markets, held in affection, but no longer entrusted with the highest forms of thought. Had that happened fully, the story of Iran would be very different. But it did not happen. Persian waited. Then it returned, not as a museum tongue, not as a relic clung to by stubborn provincials. It returned as a living literary force, supple enough to carry epic, philosophy, courtly grace, grief, memory, and the full emotional weight of a civilization that had been conquered, but not convinced of its own disappearance. That recovery did not take place in one single dramatic proclamation. It emerged over generations, especially in the eastern Iranian world, in Khorasan and Transoxiana, where local dynasties, ruling under the loose umbrella of the Abbasid order, began to patronize Persian again. These courts mattered because power always shapes language. A tongue survives in private life. It flourishes when institutions decide it is worthy of public beauty. The Samanids were crucial here. Their court became one of the places where New Persian stepped forward not as a shadow of the past, but as a language fit for serious literature and political culture. That distinction is important. Once a language proves it can carry refinement, complexity, and prestige, everything changes. It no longer belongs only to memory. It belongs to the future. And then came Ferdowsi. There are writers who matter because they are brilliant. Then there are writers who matter because they help preserve a civilization's right to remember itself. Ferdowsi was both. He spent decades composing the Shahnameh, the Book of Kings, a vast epic of Iran's mythic and historical past. On the surface, it is full of kings, champions, battles, betrayals, monstrous creatures, father-son tragedy, courtly grandeur, and the eternal nearness of fate. But under that surface, it is something even larger, an act of cultural rescue. Ferdowsi was writing in an Islamic world, under rulers whose political legitimacy did not depend on restoring ancient Iran. Yet he poured his life into preserving the memory of a pre-Arab Persian past, not to deny Islam, but to insist that Iran's story did not begin with conquest. That insistence changed everything. The Shahnameh gave generations of Persian speakers a usable past. It restored heroes, names, landscapes, moral tensions, dynastic memory.
It made it possible for people living centuries after the fall of the Sasanians to feel that the broken line had not truly been broken. It had only bent. There is something deeply human in that. A civilization wounded by conquest, sitting down, slowly, patiently, to tell its children who they had been before the fall. And because Ferdowsi was not merely dutiful, but magnificent, the act of preservation did not feel stale. The poem lived. It moved. It gave people Rustam, Sohrab, Zal, Tahmineh, figures so vivid that they still carry emotional force after 1,000 years. His language had strength, dignity, and unusual clarity. He did not write like a defeated man begging memory to survive. He wrote like someone who knew memory still had power. That power reached far beyond literature, because once Persian reestablished itself as a language of beauty and seriousness, it became more than Iran's language. It became one of the great cultural languages of the wider Islamic world. Courts from Central Asia to India used it. Poets wrote in it. Administrators worked in it. Mystics, historians, philosophers, and courtiers found in it a medium capable of both delicacy and grandeur. In other words, Iran survived not by hiding its language, but by making that language too useful, too beautiful, and too prestigious to ignore. That is survival at a very high level. And the literary flowering did not stop with Ferdowsi. It opened into centuries of brilliance. Persian poetry became one of the most refined instruments of human feeling ever developed. You see it in the moral lucidity of Saadi, in the lyric intoxication of Hafez, in the spiritual vastness of Rumi, though he belongs to a broader Persianate world rather than Iran alone. Through them, Persian became a language that could move between the intimate and the cosmic almost without friction. A cup of wine, a rose, a ruined heart, A passing breeze, a king's vanity, a dervish's insight, the nearness of God,
the absurdity of human ambition. Persian could hold all of it. And this mattered politically as well as emotionally, because culture is not ornamental when a civilization is under pressure. It is infrastructure. It carries continuity when states fail. A dynasty collapses, but a poem survives. A city burns, but a line of verse crosses mountains in memory. A conquering power imposes a new system, but the old civilizational confidence returns wherever language is still capable of transmitting value. That is what happened to Iran. Its political forms changed repeatedly. Arab caliphates, regional dynasties, Turkish rulers, these came and went. But Persian literature kept producing a sense of self that was not dependent on any single throne. It gave Iran a distributed memory, stored not only in palaces or archives, but in recitation, education, storytelling, conversation, habit. Even science and philosophy participated in this larger recovery. Thinkers like Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, emerged from the Persian-speaking world with minds vast enough to move between medicine, metaphysics, logic, and psychology. Al-Biruni studied the earth, the stars, mathematics, language, and India with a patience and precision that still feel modern. Much of this scholarship moved through Arabic as well, of course, because Arabic remained indispensable to the intellectual world of Islam. But the men themselves were products of a civilizational environment in which Iranian habits of learning, court culture, and literary confidence had fully reawakened. That is worth lingering on. Iran did not recover by withdrawing into some wounded cultural purity. It recovered by becoming central to the civilization that had once conquered it. It entered the Islamic world so completely and contributed to it so decisively that Persian identity came back stronger inside the new order than it might have by standing outside it. This is one of history's strangest and most beautiful reversals. The conqueror wins the land. The conquered reshape the civilization. But history never lets one recovery remain untested for long. Even as Persian language and culture rose into new brilliance, new military powers were gathering on the horizons of Iran. Turkish dynasties were beginning to dominate the political field. They would rule in Persian, dream in Persian, and adorn themselves with Persian prestige, but they would also bring new forms of force, new elite structures, and eventually new fractures. Iran would absorb them too, but not without cost. The Turks did not arrive in Iran as poets. They arrived as fighters. They came out of the steppe world with speed, discipline, and the hard instincts of mobile power. Their strength was military before it was cultural. They could break armies, seize cities, and replace dynasties. But what happened next is one of the most revealing patterns in Iranian history. Again and again, the men who conquered Iran ended up borrowing its language, its administrative habits, its courtly ideals, even its imagination of what rulership should look like. In other words, they won the state and then entered the civilization. This began to happen in earnest with the Ghaznavids, and then even more clearly with the Seljuks. These were Turkic dynasties, military in origin, ambitious, often ruthless in expansion. But when they established courts over Iranian lands, they did not build those courts from scratch in some purely Turkic image. They relied on Persian bureaucrats, Persian scribes, Persian political wisdom, Persian literary prestige. They fought like conquerors,
and governed like men who had quickly realized they were living inside an older and more sophisticated house. That older house mattered, because ruling Iran required more than force. It required paperwork, tax systems, ceremonial fluency, urban administration, and the ability to speak to settled populations whose memory stretched far beyond the lifetime of any frontier warlord. Persian gave them that. So did Persianate court culture,
with its polished ethics of kingship, its visual splendor, its deep respect for learned men, poets, jurists, and secretaries. One of the clearest figures here is Nizam al-Mulk, the great Persian vizier of the Seljuk age. He was not a king, not the face on the banners, not the man charging at the front of battle. Yet, in some ways, he represents Iran's survival more clearly than any conqueror could. Men like him taught ruling dynasties how to govern lands they had won by the sword, but did not yet understand. His world was one of memoranda, appointments, intelligence networks, court discipline, educational patronage, practical statecraft. He embodies a truth that runs quietly through this whole story. Conquest can seize power, but continuity often belongs to administrators. The Seljuk era, for all its warfare, was also a period of extraordinary cultural vitality. Cities such as Nishapur, Isfahan, Rai, and Merv became intellectual and commercial centers where scholars, theologians, physicians, astronomers, merchants, and poets moved through the same urban space. Libraries grew, madrasas were founded, Persian prose matured, Persian poetry kept evolving into forms of astonishing refinement. The civilization was not merely surviving under foreign dynasts, it was flowering. That paradox matters, because when we say Iran survived Greeks, Arabs, Turks, and Mongols, survival should not sound passive. It was often creative, productive. It generated new beauty under pressure. Sometimes the very centuries of foreign political rule became the centuries in which Persian culture expanded most confidently across the wider world. You can feel that in the people this era produced. Omar Khayyam is a perfect example. A mathematician, astronomer, and poet, he belonged to a world where science and lyric reflection still touched each other naturally. He could help calculate the calendar with remarkable precision and also write verses that made mortality feel intimate, almost warm in the hand. Whether later generations read him too romantically is another matter. What matters for us is that he came from a Persianate civilization robust enough to produce exact thinking and emotional subtlety side by side. The same is true, in a different register, for the great Sufi currents moving through the Persian-speaking world. Here, the language became even more flexible, capable of carrying longing, ecstasy, irony, philosophical depth, and spiritual yearning without losing its elegance. Persian became one of the great languages of inwardness, not only of kings and empires, but of the soul trying to speak to itself. And that gave Iranian civilization another advantage in survival. A culture rooted only in state power dies when the state collapses. A culture that also lives in poetry, prayer, conversation, ethical teaching, private recitation, and learned habit can survive much worse. It can go underground. It can move. It can wait. Which is fortunate because worse was coming. The Turkish dynasties that ruled Iran were powerful, but they were not permanent. Their realms split. Succession struggles multiplied. Regional powers rose and broke apart.
By the early 13th century, the political map of the Iranian world had become unstable again, and instability on the eastern approaches of Iran has often invited disaster. This time, the disaster would arrive on a scale that made earlier conquests look almost restrained. The Mongols did not come to rule elegantly at first. They came to punish. And when they struck the Iranian world, they did not merely replace rulers. They shattered cities, populations, irrigation systems, trade patterns, and whole regions of settled life with a force that felt, to those living through it, like the end of civilization itself. If the Greeks had defeated an empire, and the Arabs had transformed a civilization,
The Mongols would test something even more basic: whether Iran could survive when the ground beneath culture itself seemed to be cut away. There are conquests that replace rulers, and there are conquests that make people wonder whether history itself has come to an end. The Mongol invasion belonged to the second kind. When Genghis Khan turned his gaze toward the Iranian world in the early 13th century, the disaster began, as so many disasters do, with arrogance and miscalculation. Envoys were insulted, merchants were killed. A frontier quarrel became a civilizational sentence. Then the Mongol armies came west with that terrible combination that makes destruction so complete: speed, discipline, adaptability, and a total willingness to use terror not as excess, but as method. What they did to the Iranian world left scars so deep that later centuries still seemed to speak from inside them. Cities that had once been centers of learning, trade, law, poetry, and refined urban life were smashed with a violence difficult to absorb even now. Merv, Nishapur, Herat, places that had held memory for generations, became warnings. Contemporary chroniclers, even allowing for exaggeration born of trauma, write with a tone that feels physically shaken. They are not simply recording defeat. They are trying to describe scale beyond ordinary language. That is how catastrophe often appears to those inside it, not merely as loss, but as disproportionality. Too much death, too quickly, too little left standing to interpret it. The Mongols did not only kill, they unraveled systems. Irrigation channels were neglected, damaged, or destroyed. Agricultural land fell out of cultivation. Trade routes were disrupted and then reconfigured under new conditions. Urban populations collapsed. Families were scattered. Scholarly networks broke. The older confidence of settled life of cities, with schools and markets and mosques and routines that made tomorrow feel possible, was shattered across much of the plateau. And what makes this chapter especially painful is that Iran had already survived so much. It had outlived imperial collapse. It had absorbed foreign rule. It had rebuilt itself through language, learning, and cultural prestige. Then, in the Mongol century, it seemed for a moment that none of those subtler strengths would matter if the human and material base of civilization itself could be ground down hard enough. This is the closest Iran comes in our story to disappearance. Not true disappearance, but something near it. A condition in which survival no longer looks noble or culturally confident. It looks raw, reduced, local. A question rather than an achievement. Imagine the feeling of that. A city where people once debated theology, copied poetry, bought silk, arranged marriages, argued over law, taught children to write, repaired fountains, and moved through the market under awnings of shade.
Then silence, ash, broken walls, and the strange humiliation of continuing to live among ruins that seemed to prove the world had no obligation to remain intelligible. That is not just political collapse. That is psychological collapse. And yet even here, even in this chapter, the old pattern does not disappear entirely. Because the Mongols, like so many conquerors before them, did not remain what they had been at the moment of invasion. At first, they seemed to stand outside civilization altogether, too brutal to be absorbed, too destructive to be educated by the lands they had taken. But history in Iran has a way of wearing down foreign hardness. Not quickly, not mercifully, but steadily. Once conquest settles into possession, possession begins to need administration. Administration needs literate men, tax records, local cooperation, legal habits, agricultural recovery, language, symbolism,
and some working theory of legitimacy. That is when Iran begins its work on the conqueror. The Ilkhanate, the Mongol state established over Iran, did not stay frozen in its first violent form. Over time, its rulers grew more Persian in habit, more urban in expectation, more dependent on Iranian administrators and cultural forms. Courts became less purely steppe in their mental world. Patronage returned. Bureaucratic sophistication reappeared. Islam eventually entered the ruling framework. Persian regained visible strength. This does not erase the horror of the invasion. Nothing should. It only reminds us that even devastation on this scale did not stop the deeper civilizational process forever. Iran could be broken open. It could be depopulated, humiliated, disfigured, but it still had the capacity, after enough time, to begin altering the men who ruled its wreckage. There is something almost unbearable in that kind of endurance, because it is not romantic. It does not arrive in a triumphant speech. It is slow, uneven, and full of grief. Recovery does not mean that the dead return or the old cities reappear exactly as they were. It means something harder. People begin again without ever fully escaping what happened. Under Ghazan Khan and his successors, some measure of reconstruction became possible. Taxes were rationalized more effectively. Agriculture was encouraged back toward life. Persian became central again in administration and high culture. And in one of those astonishing reversals history occasionally produces, the Mongol court helped sponsor one of the great intellectual projects of the age. Rashid al-Din, statesman, scholar, and historian, compiled a vast universal history that tried to place the peoples of the world into one written frame. That ambition alone tells you something had changed. The conquerors, who once reduced cities to skull piles, were now participating in textual civilization, in record-keeping, in the Persian habit of organizing memory rather than merely trampling it. That change was real, but it never made the century harmless. Even after the first Mongol shock softened into a new political order, the memory of what had been destroyed remained. And as if Iran had not already been tested enough, another wave of devastation came later with Timur, whose campaigns in the 14th century reopened wounds the plateau had never fully healed. Timur was not exactly Mongol, not exactly Turk, but he carried forward that same terrifying capacity for organized destruction.
Cities that had recovered only partially could be punished all over again. And yet, in one of the strangest turns in Iranian history, the Timurid age also became a period of artistic brilliance. Herat flowered. Painting refined itself into miniature worlds of jewel-like precision. Calligraphy, poetry, architecture, learning, these rose again from lands that had every reason to produce only bitterness. This is one of the hardest truths in the whole story. Iran did not survive by avoiding trauma. It survived by continuing to produce beauty after trauma. Not because beauty erased suffering, but because it kept civilization from being reduced to suffering alone. That is why the Mongol and post-Mongol centuries matter so much. They test the strongest version of our central question. Could Iran endure not just conquest, not just conversion, not just foreign rule, but civilizational wounding on a near-apocalyptic scale? The answer, against every expectation, was yes. Wounded, yes. Altered, certainly. Less whole than before, in many regions, and for many generations. But not dead. And from those ruins, eventually, a new Iran would rise again. This time with a sharper religious identity, a more self-conscious distinction from its neighbors, and a state that would permanently redefine what being Iranian meant. The Safavids were coming, and with them, Iran would not merely survive, it would decide, more explicitly than ever before, who it was. By the time the Safavids rose in the early 16th century, Iran had already survived enough history for several civilizations. It had known imperial glory, collapse, conquest, conversion, recovery, massacre, and rebirth. It had been ruled by men who spoke Greek, Arabic, Turkic, Mongolian dialects, and Persian. It had watched capitals burn and languages of prestige change. It had buried dynasties and rebuilt memory more than once. But under the Safavids, something happened that gave all that endurance a new shape. Iran became more sharply itself again. Not in some pure or untouched form. History had long since made purity impossible. Too much had been absorbed, too much had been lost and reworked, but Safavid rule did something decisive. It fused Iranian kingship with Twelver Shi'ism, and in doing so, created a durable sense of difference from the surrounding Sunni world. That mattered enormously, because civilizations do not survive only by remembering who they were. Sometimes they survive by deciding, under pressure, who they are now. Shah Ismail's rise was wild, violent, nearly messianic in force. He did not come forward like a careful statesman. He came with zeal, charisma, and a movement sharpened by devotion. When he seized power, he did more than found a dynasty. He imposed a religious transformation whose consequences would last far longer than his battles. Iran, still majority Sunni at the time, was pushed, often brutally, toward Shi'ism. Clerics were empowered. Ritual life changed. Public identity changed. The map of belonging changed. This was not gentle work, but it was lasting work, and once that identity took root, it became one of the great anchors of Iranian distinctiveness. Language had preserved Iran through earlier centuries. Now, religion, in a newly institutionalized form, joined language as a second pillar of continuity. Then came Shah Abbas I, and with him one of those rare rulers who not only inherit a country,
but rearrange its possibilities. Abbas was hard, calculating, and often ruthless, but he also had genuine state-building genius. He broke the power of tribal forces that had made Safavid rule unstable.
He reorganized the army. He strengthened the center. He made diplomacy serve strategy. And most famously, he remade Isfahan into one of the most beautiful capitals on earth. There are cities that feel built for administration. Isfahan, under Abbas, felt built for civilization. Its great square, its mosques, its bridges, its bazaars, its domes shifting in color with light, these were not merely ornaments of power. They were physical arguments. They said that Iran was not a wounded remnant of old empires, not a land merely surviving on inherited memory, but a place still capable of making beauty at full scale. A place where architecture, commerce, ceremony, devotion, and urban life could still be woven into something that made foreigners stare and locals feel the dignity of inhabiting it. That matters more than we sometimes admit, because beauty is a civilizational fact. It tells people that their world is worth continuing. Safavid Iran gave that feeling to itself again, and even when the dynasty weakened, even when Afghan invasion and later political fragmentation broke its power, the deeper transformation remained. Iran was now unmistakably Persian-speaking, historically self-aware, and Shii in public identity. The old civilizational thread had not merely survived, it had thickened. The centuries that followed were harsher, less stable, often more humiliating. The Qajar period in particular exposed Iran to a newer form of threat. Not the old conquering army alone, but imperial pressure in the modern sense. Russia pushed from the north. Britain manipulated from the south. Territory was lost. Concessions were sold. Sovereignty began to leak away, not always through one great defeat, but through signatures, debts, influence, and dependency. There is a special bitterness in that kind of weakening. A people can sometimes endure open conquest with grim clarity, but to feel your country being reduced through corruption, foreign leverage, court weakness, and slow humiliation, that produces a different kind of wound. It feels less heroic, more suffocating. And yet, even here, Iran did not go empty. Merchants protested. Clerics intervened. Intellectuals argued. The tobacco protest, the constitutional revolution. These were signs that Iranian society still possessed internal life strong enough to resist political decay. The country was not a passive object of empire. It was still thinking, still reacting, still trying to invent a modern form of dignity under terrible pressure. Then came the Pahlavi state, with its own contradiction. Reza Shah, and later his son, tried to modernize Iran quickly, centrally, and often coercively. Railways, bureaucracy, secular courts, universities, a stronger army. These were real transformations. So were repression, forced unveiling, political control, and the dangerous fantasy that modernization could be imposed from above without deep consent. The 20th century in Iran feels, in many ways, like the old story retold under new conditions. Foreign interference returned in modern clothes. Oil replaced older tribute as the resource over which outsiders and local elites struggled. The 1953 coup, which toppled Mossadegh after he tried to nationalize Iran's oil, left a mark far deeper than one change of government. It confirmed, for millions of Iranians, that even in the modern world, their sovereignty could still be bent by outside powers working through local weakness. That memory mattered in 1979,
The Islamic Revolution was not simply a revolt against a monarch. It was a revolt against humiliation, dependency, inequality, and the feeling that Iran's future was being written in languages not its own. The revolution then created a system full of its own contradictions: religious authority and republican forms, mass participation and repression, social welfare and ideological control, resistance to foreign domination, and new forms of internal coercion. And still, the deeper continuity remained.
That is what is so striking. The state changed again.
The official moral vocabulary changed. Foreign policy changed. Social rules changed. But Persian endured. Nowruz endured. Family endurance endured. Poetry endured. The habit of carrying history inside ordinary speech endured. Hafez was still quoted. The Shahnameh still lived. The land still shaped the people who crossed it. Mountains, deserts, gardens, bazaars, courtyards, hospitality, argument, melancholy, wit, all of it continued. Even the diaspora became part of that survival story. Millions left Iran across the late 20th and early 21st centuries. But they did not leave Iranian civilization behind as if it were luggage too heavy to carry. They rebuilt it abroad in smaller forms: language schools, Nowruz tables, restaurants, poetry nights, music, film, engineering, medicine, family rituals carried into new climates. Iranian identity became portable without becoming weightless. That is no small achievement. Many civilizations survive in museums. Iran survived in people. And that, finally, is the answer to the question we began with. How did Iran survive Greeks, Arabs, Turks, and Mongols for 2,500 years? Not because it always won militarily. Often it did not. Not because its states were unbreakable. They were broken repeatedly. Not because its rulers were always wise. Many were not. Iran survived because the deepest parts of a civilization do not live only in palaces or armies. They live in language, in family structure, in ritual time, in stories repeated until they become emotional inheritance, in the ability to absorb what arrives from outside without surrendering the inner habits that make a people recognizable to themselves, in the refusal to let defeat become self-erasure. The Greeks conquered an empire, but they did not end Iran. The Arabs transformed the religious and political order, but they did not erase Iran. The Turks ruled its states, but they entered its civilization. The Mongols shattered its cities, but they did not kill its memory. Again and again, what came from outside was forced, eventually, to live inside an older, deeper continuity. Sometimes that continuity bent so far it nearly disappeared from view. But it returned. In verse, in courtly custom, in spring festivals, in architecture, in scholarship, in the private dignity of people who kept speaking Persian to their children even when empires changed overhead. That is the quiet miracle here, not immortality. Iran has suffered too much for that word to feel honest. Something harder than immortality. Persistence with memory. A civilization that learned how to lose almost everything except itself. And now, as the night settles more fully around us, Perhaps that is the gentlest thing to leave with. Not the names of kings, though they mattered, not the dates of battles, though they changed lives, but the deeper pattern beneath them all. A land of mountains, deserts, gardens, and long remembrance. A people repeatedly struck, repeatedly altered, repeatedly forced to begin again. And yet, still speaking, still gathering, still carrying forward the old, patient work of remaining.